"This isn't a fashion show." Those were the exact words Sandra Patterson used before she fired me over Zoom in front of 12 colleagues. I was wearing a comfortable sweater and had my hair in a messy bun during what I thought was just another routine Tuesday team check-in. Within minutes of hanging up that call, I was locked out of my email, my company laptop was remotely wiped, and my 5-year career at Meridian Defense Solutions was over. What Sandra didn't realize in her rush to humiliate me was that she had just fired the only person in the entire company who controlled our biggest government contract. My name is Lena Carter, and until that Tuesday morning in March, I was the senior compliance analyst for Meridian Defense Solutions, a mid-sized government contracting firm based in Arlington, Virginia. I had spent the last 5 years of my life building an impeccable track record in federal contract management, specializing in cybersecurity protocols for Department of Defense projects. What made me invaluable wasn't just my expertise, it was my security clearance. Getting a top-secret security clearance isn't something you can do overnight. The process took me 18 months of intensive background checks, interviews with neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years, financial audits that went back to my college pizza delivery job, and psychological evaluations that would make a therapist blush. The government doesn't hand out these clearances lightly, and once you have one, you become part of a very exclusive club. For the past 2 years, I had been the primary point of contact for our biggest contract ever, a $199 million cybersecurity infrastructure project with the Department of Defense. This wasn't just any contract. It was the kind of deal that could make or break a company like Meridian. We had beaten out 3 major competitors, including 2 Fortune 500 companies, to win this bid. The profit margins were incredible, and the contract had options for renewal that could extend it for another 5 years. The project involved developing secure communication networks for military installations across the eastern seaboard. Every document, every protocol, every single piece of correspondence had to be handled by someone with the appropriate clearance level. That someone was me. Not Sandra, not our CEO James Harrison, not even our head of security. Just me. Sandra Patterson had only been promoted to department head 8 months ago, and from day one, she made it clear that she didn't appreciate my work-from-home arrangement. Before the pandemic, Meridian had been strictly an in-office company. But when COVID hit, we all adapted to remote work, and honestly, I was more productive at home. No office politics, no interruptions, no time wasted commuting through DC traffic. I could focus on the complex regulatory requirements that kept our government contracts compliant. But Sandra saw remote work as a threat to her authority. She started implementing arbitrary rules about video calls, demanding that everyone be camera ready for even the most basic status updates. She would schedule unnecessary meetings just to check if people were properly dressed. She seemed to think that managing people meant controlling their appearance rather than focusing on their results. The irony was that my work performance had never been better. I had streamlined our compliance processes, caught several potential violations before they became problems, and maintained a perfect record with Pentagon auditors. The Department of Defense had specifically praised our team's responsiveness and attention to detail in their last quarterly review. They had even mentioned me by name in their commendation letter. But Sandra was more concerned with power plays than performance metrics. She had been gunning for more control over the defense contracts ever since her promotion, and I think she saw me as an obstacle to that ambition. What she didn't understand was that government contracting isn't like managing a sales team. You can't just reassign responsibilities or promote someone into a role they're not qualified for. The Pentagon doesn't care about your corporate org chart if you don't have the proper credentials. That Tuesday morning started like any other. I had logged into our weekly team meeting wearing a comfortable cream-colored sweater and jeans. My hair was in a casual bun because I had been planning to exercise after the call. It was a routine status update, the kind of meeting where we usually just went around the virtual room sharing brief project updates. I had prepared my usual report on the defense contract milestones. But Sandra had apparently decided to make an example of me. Right in front of everyone, she started criticizing my appearance, saying that I looked unprofessional and that working from home was clearly affecting my standards. When I tried to redirect the conversation back to work topics, she cut me off and said those words that would change everything. "This isn't a fashion show." Then she did something that shocked everyone on the call. She terminated my employment immediately. No warning, no documentation, no discussion with HR. Just a public execution designed to assert her dominance. The other team members sat in stunned silence as she announced that my access would be revoked immediately and that someone would contact me about returning company property. Within 10 minutes of that call ending, I couldn't access my email. My laptop screen went blank as the IT department remotely wiped everything. My phone stopped receiving company notifications. It was like 5 years of my professional life had just been erased with the click of a button. I sat in my home office staring at the blank laptop screen, trying to process what had just happened. Sandra had been so focused on humiliating me that she had rushed through the termination without following proper procedures. She hadn't consulted with HR about the paperwork. She hadn't coordinated with the security department about clearance protocols. Most importantly, she hadn't considered the implications for our active government contracts. As the shock began to wear off, I started receiving text messages from colleagues who had been on the call. Rachel Martinez, one of the junior analysts, was the first to reach out. Her message was simple but telling. "What just happened? Are you okay? This doesn't make sense." More messages followed throughout the day. People who had worked with me for years were expressing confusion and concern. They knew my work quality, they knew my dedication to the company, and they couldn't understand how a disagreement about video call attire had led to immediate termination. But as I reflected on the situation, I began to realize something that sent a chill down my spine. In her rush to fire me, Sandra had forgotten about the most important aspect of my job, the security clearance requirements for our biggest contract. The Pentagon required that all primary contacts maintain active clearance and employment status with cleared contractors. If someone left the company, there were specific procedures for transferring responsibilities to qualified personnel. Those procedures took time. And we didn't have time. I spent the rest of that week trying to process my sudden unemployment while watching the situation unfold from the outside. By Friday, Rachel called me in a panic, and what she told me made my blood run cold. The company was in complete chaos. Sandra had apparently spent the last 3 days trying to figure out how to handle the defense contract without me, and the reality was hitting her hard. The contract kickoff meeting with Pentagon officials was scheduled for the following Monday, just 72 hours away. This wasn't a routine status call. This was the formal launch of a $199 million project with senior military officials, Department of Defense auditors, and Meridian's executive team. Rachel explained that Sandra had been frantically calling the Pentagon security office trying to get expedited clearances for other team members. What she discovered was a bureaucratic nightmare that apparently no one had bothered to explain to her during her management training. Security clearances don't work like parking passes. You can't just fill out a form and get immediate access to classified projects. The minimum processing time for a top-secret clearance was 90 days, and that was only if the candidate passed the initial screening. Most applications took 6 to 12 months. The government wasn't going to compromise national security because some corporate manager had made a rash personnel decision. But Sandra's problems went deeper than just the timing issue. Rachel told me that during her desperate calls to the Pentagon, Sandra had apparently tried to misrepresent the company's current clearance status. She had implied that other team members already had the necessary credentials, which was absolutely false. This kind of misrepresentation to federal officials was not just embarrassing, it could be considered fraud. By the weekend, the situation had escalated beyond Sandra's ability to contain it. The company's stock price had started dropping on Friday afternoon when rumors began circulating about potential problems with the defense contract. Government contracting is a small world, and word travels fast when major deals are in jeopardy. I decided to consult with an employment attorney about wrongful termination. During that consultation, I learned some disturbing information about Sandra's recent activities. My lawyer had done some preliminary research and discovered that Sandra had been building a case against me for months, documenting minor issues, and creating a paper trail that suggested I was a problem employee. The evidence painted a picture of someone who had been planning my removal long before the Tuesday meeting. She had been questioning my work-from-home arrangement with HR, challenging my project decisions in emails to senior management, and even suggesting that the company needed fresh leadership on the defense contract. What she hadn't anticipated was that getting rid of me would be infinitely more complicated than hiring me had been. Over the weekend, I received several more calls from colleagues who were sharing inside information about the growing crisis. The picture they painted was of a company in complete panic mode. Sandra had spent Friday afternoon in emergency meetings with the CEO and the head of security trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. The legal department had been brought in to review the termination paperwork, and they had discovered several procedural violations. HR was scrambling to understand why they hadn't been consulted before such a crucial employee was let go. The security team was trying to figure out how to maintain compliance with federal regulations when their primary cleared personnel was no longer with the company. But the most telling detail came from Marcus Thompson, a senior project manager who had been with Meridian for over a decade. He told me that during one of the emergency meetings, Sandra had actually suggested that they could forge my electronic signature on contract documents until they found a replacement. The suggestion was so outrageous that it caused the CEO to question her judgment for the first time since her promotion. As Sunday evening approached, I found myself in a strange position. I was angry about how I had been treated, but I was also watching a slow-motion disaster unfold that could destroy a company I had helped build. The defense contract wasn't just important to Meridian's bottom line, it was critical to actual national security infrastructure. The project involved protecting military communications systems that could literally save lives. I had worked too hard on that project to watch it fail because of one person's ego and incompetence. But I also wasn't about to let Sandra off the hook for what she had done to me. If she wanted to play power games, she was about to learn that some positions require actual power, not just a fancy title. Monday morning was coming fast, and with it the most important meeting in Meridian's corporate history. Sandra was about to discover that firing someone in government contracting isn't like firing someone in sales or marketing. When national security is involved, your personnel decisions become everyone's business, especially the Pentagon's. I spent Sunday evening preparing for what I suspected would be a very interesting week. Because while Sandra had been focused on asserting her authority over dress codes and video calls, she had forgotten the most important rule in government contracting: never make personnel decisions that you can't explain to federal auditors. And federal auditors, I knew from experience, were not nearly as forgiving as corporate HR departments. Monday morning brought an email that changed everything. It arrived at 6:43 a.m., sent to my personal email address from an official Pentagon account. The subject line read, "Urgent Security Compliance Verification Required. Meridian Defense Solutions, Contract 2024, DoD 7891. The email was from Colonel David Martinez, the lead auditor for our defense contract. Colonel Martinez had a reputation in the government contracting world that made grown executives nervous. He was known for his meticulous attention to detail and his absolute intolerance for any kind of security violation or misrepresentation. Companies that tried to cut corners or bend rules around Colonel Martinez usually found themselves permanently blacklisted from federal contracts. The email was professionally polite but contained a request that made my heart race. Colonel Martinez was asking me to attend an unscheduled compliance verification meeting at Meridian's offices that morning. He specifically mentioned that Pentagon records showed me as the primary security contact for the contract, and that recent personnel reports had created some confusion that needed immediate clarification. I realized immediately what had happened. Sandra's desperate calls to the Pentagon security office hadn't just failed to solve her clearance problem, they had triggered an automatic audit protocol. When a cleared contractor reports personnel changes on an active project, especially changes involving primary security contacts, the Pentagon has standard procedures for verifying that security protocols haven't been compromised. What Sandra had intended as damage control had actually escalated the situation to the highest level of Pentagon oversight. Colonel Martinez wasn't coming to Meridian for a friendly chat about paperwork. He was conducting an emergency audit to determine whether the company was still qualified to handle classified materials. As I prepared for the meeting, my phone started buzzing with increasingly frantic messages. Sandra had apparently discovered that the Pentagon audit was happening and was trying to reach me. Her texts progressed from professional requests to desperate pleas over the course of 30 minutes. First message, Lena, we need to discuss the Pentagon meeting this morning. Please call me immediately. Second message, this is urgent. We can resolve the employment situation. Please respond. Third message, Lena, I need you at this meeting. We can work out a consultant arrangement. Fourth message, please. The company needs you right now. We can discuss your concerns. I didn't respond to any of them. Sandra had made her position very clear during that Zoom call. Now she was going to live with the consequences of her decision. Meanwhile, I was receiving calls from Meridian's legal team offering settlement agreements and immediate reinstatement. The company's lawyers had apparently spent the weekend researching wrongful termination law and had concluded that Sandra's actions exposed the company to significant liability. They were offering me a generous severance package, a written apology, and immediate reinstatement to avoid a lawsuit. But I wasn't interested in their settlement offers. I wanted to see how this played out. Sandra had humiliated me in front of my colleagues and destroyed my job security over something as trivial as video call attire. She had shown a complete disregard for my contributions to the company and my professional reputation. Now she was about to face the consequences of making personnel decisions without understanding their implications. I decided to attend the Pentagon meeting not to help Meridian, but to protect my own professional reputation. My security clearance was my career asset, and I wasn't going to let Sandra's incompetence damage my standing with federal officials. I had worked too hard to build relationships with Pentagon auditors to let this situation reflect poorly on my credibility. As I drove to Meridian's offices that morning, I reflected on the irony of the situation. Sandra had fired me for not looking professional during a video call, but her own actions had been so unprofessional that they had triggered a federal investigation. She had been so concerned about control and appearances that she had forgotten the basic requirements of the job she was trying to do. When I arrived at the Meridian building, the atmosphere was tense. Security guards escorted me to the conference room where Colonel Martinez was already seated with 2 other Pentagon officials. The Meridian team included CEO James Harrison's Sandra, the head of legal, and several other executives I didn't recognize. Colonel Martinez was exactly what I expected, a career military officer who radiated competence and no-nonsense professionalism. He was probably in his early 50s with graying hair and the kind of posture that came from decades of military discipline. When he spoke, everyone in the room paid attention. He began the meeting by explaining the purpose of the audit. The Pentagon had received conflicting information about Meridian's personnel roster for the defense contract. Some reports indicated that the primary security contact had been terminated, while others suggested that the personnel change was temporary or administrative in nature. Colonel Martinez was there to get definitive answers and ensure that security protocols hadn't been compromised. Sandra tried to take control of the narrative from the beginning. She explained that there had been a minor personnel adjustment and that the company was in the process of transitioning responsibilities to other qualified team members. She assured Colonel Martinez that there would be no impact on the contract timeline or deliverables. But Colonel Martinez wasn't interested in corporate spin. He asked direct, specific questions about security clearances, personnel authorization, and compliance procedures. When Sandra tried to deflect or provide vague answers, he pressed for documentation and verification. The turning point came when Colonel Martinez asked to see the current personnel authorization forms for the contract. These forms listed every individual who had access to classified materials, along with their clearance levels and specific roles. Sandra confidently pulled out a folder of documents, clearly believing that she had everything under control. Colonel Martinez reviewed the documents carefully, cross-referencing them with his own records. Then he asked the question that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. According to these forms, Ms. Carter is still listed as the primary security contact for this contract. Can you confirm that she maintains active clearance and employment status with your company? The room went completely silent. Sandra's face went pale as she realized the trap she had walked into. If she admitted that I had been terminated, she would have to explain why the personnel forms hadn't been updated and why she had misrepresented the company's compliance status to federal officials. If she tried to maintain that I was still employed, she would be lying to a Pentagon auditor, which could result in criminal charges. James Harrison, the CEO, looked confused and asked Sandra to clarify my employment status. It was clear that he hadn't been fully briefed on the details of my termination or its implications for the contract. Colonel Martinez waited patiently for an answer, but his expression made it clear that he already knew what had happened. Pentagon auditors don't walk into meetings without doing their homework. He had probably verified my employment status before the meeting even started. Sandra tried to explain that there had been a personnel transition that was still being processed, but Colonel Martinez cut her off. He stated that federal regulations required immediate notification of any changes to cleared personnel and that unauthorized access to classified materials was a serious violation that could result in contract termination and criminal prosecution. The meeting was suspended while Colonel Martinez made several phone calls to Pentagon security officials. The Meridian executives were left sitting in uncomfortable silence, finally understanding the magnitude of the crisis that Sandra had created. When Colonel Martinez returned to the room, he delivered the news that everyone had been dreading. The contract was being placed under immediate security review. All classified materials were to be secured, and all work was to be suspended until the Pentagon could verify that security protocols hadn't been compromised. The $199 million deal that Sandra had been so eager to control was now in serious jeopardy, and it was entirely due to her decision to fire me over video call etiquette. As the meeting concluded, Colonel Martinez asked me to remain for a brief private discussion. After the Meridian executives left the room, he thanked me for coming and assured me that the Pentagon's investigation would focus on corporate procedures rather than individual compliance. He also mentioned something that gave me hope for the future of the project. The Pentagon valued stability and competence in their contractor relationships. If Meridian could resolve their personnel issues and demonstrate proper security protocols, there might still be a path forward for the contract. But that path would require some significant changes in how the company handled its most important relationships. And it would definitely require a better understanding of the difference between corporate authority and federal compliance. As I left the Meridian building that morning, I knew that Sandra's day was about to get much worse. The formal contract kickoff meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning in Meridian's largest conference room. This was supposed to be a celebration, the official launch of the biggest deal in company history. Instead, it had become a last-ditch attempt to salvage a contract that was hanging by a thread. I learned about the chaos leading up to the meeting from multiple sources. Rachel had been texting me regular updates, and Marcus Thompson called me Wednesday evening to describe what he called the most dysfunctional corporate crisis he had ever witnessed. Sandra had spent the entire week trying to undo the damage from Monday's Pentagon audit. She had hired an expensive consulting firm to expedite security clearance applications for 3 different employees. She had flown to Washington twice for emergency meetings with Defense Department officials. She had even tried to convince James Harrison to delay the contract kickoff for 60 days while they sorted out the personnel issues. But the Pentagon operates on different timelines than corporate America. Colonel Martinez had made it clear that any further delays would result in automatic contract termination. The Department of Defense had other qualified contractors waiting for the opportunity to take over the project. Meridian had one chance to prove they could meet their obligations, and that chance was Thursday morning. The meeting was scheduled to include high-level representatives from both organizations. From the Pentagon side, Colonel Martinez would be joined by General Patricia Williams, the Deputy Director of Cybersecurity Operations, and several other senior officials. From Meridian CEO James Harrison would present alongside Sandra and the entire executive team. The centerpiece of the meeting was supposed to be the formal signing of the Security Compliance Certification. This document confirmed that Meridian met all federal requirements for handling classified materials and that all personnel had appropriate clearances and authorizations. Without this certification, the contract could not proceed, and that certification required my electronic signature as the verified security agent. Wednesday evening, Sandra made one final desperate attempt to reach me. Instead of calling or texting, she showed up at my apartment. I watched through the security camera as she stood outside my door for 20 minutes, pressing the buzzer repeatedly. When I didn't answer, she left a handwritten note that was part apology and part plea. The note read, "Lena, I made a mistake. I let personal conflicts interfere with business decisions, and I'm sorry. The company needs you and I need you. Please consider coming to tomorrow's meeting. We can work out any compensation or title issues you want to discuss. The team needs their leader back. It was too little too late." Sandra had shown her true character during that Zoom call, and no amount of corporate desperation was going to change what had happened. She had chosen to humiliate me in front of my colleagues over something completely trivial. Now she was going to face the consequences of that choice. Thursday morning arrived with all the tension of a corporate execution. I decided to watch the meeting remotely through the company's internal live stream system. My access credentials hadn't been revoked from all systems, apparently due to the rushed nature of my termination. I could see everything that was happening in the conference room in real time. The Meridian executives looked nervous as they prepared their presentation materials. Sandra was wearing a severely professional black suit and had her hair pulled back in a tight bun. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was now obsessing over her own appearance for a meeting that would determine the company's future. The Pentagon officials arrived precisely on time, led by General Williams and Colonel Martinez. They were accompanied by 2 auditors from the Defense Contract Management Agency and a cybersecurity specialist from the National Security Agency. This wasn't just a contract signing, it was a comprehensive evaluation of Meridian's capabilities and integrity. James Harrison began the meeting with a confident presentation about Meridian's track record and capabilities. He highlighted the company's successful completion of previous contracts and outlined their plan for the cybersecurity infrastructure project. His presentation was smooth and professional, but I could see the tension in his body language. When it came time to discuss security protocols, Sandra took over the presentation. She walked through the company's security procedures, personnel training programs, and compliance monitoring systems. Everything she said was accurate and well prepared, but there was a fundamental problem that she was trying to ignore. General Williams listened politely to the presentation, but when Sandra finished, she asked the question that everyone in the room was dreading. "Who is your current verified security agent for this contract?" Sandra hesitated for a moment before responding that they were in the process of transitioning security responsibilities to a new qualified team member. She tried to sound confident, but her voice betrayed her anxiety. Colonel Martinez pulled out his tablet and consulted the official personnel records. "According to our documentation, Miss Lena Carter is listed as your primary security contact. Is she present today to complete the certification process?" The silence in the room was deafening. Sandra looked around desperately as if I might magically appear. James Harrison's expression shifted from confidence to confusion as he began to understand the scope of the problem. Sandra attempted to explain that there had been recent personnel changes and that the documentation was being updated. But General Williams interrupted her with a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Are you telling us that your primary security contact is no longer employed by your company?" At this point, Sandra made the mistake that sealed her fate and destroyed any chance of salvaging the contract. Instead of admitting the truth and accepting responsibility, she tried to deceive federal officials in real time. She claimed that I was temporarily assigned to another project, but remained available for security certification purposes. Then, in an act of desperation that I could hardly believe I was witnessing, she attempted to access my electronic signature credentials from her laptop. What Sandra didn't know was that my digital certificates were protected by multiple layers of security, including biometric verification and real-time authentication protocols. When she tried to access my credentials, she triggered automatic security alerts that immediately notified both Meridian's IT department and the Pentagon's cybersecurity monitoring systems. Within minutes, both organizations received notifications of unauthorized access attempts on classified systems. Colonel Martinez's phone buzzed with an emergency alert, and he immediately consulted his device while Sandra continued fumbling with her laptop. The moment Colonel Martinez announced that they were receiving federal cybersecurity alerts related to credential tampering, the entire atmosphere in the room changed. General Williams stood up and formally suspended the meeting pending a security investigation. The Pentagon officials began making phone calls to their security teams, and the Meridian executives realized that they were witnessing a potential criminal act. James Harrison demanded to know what Sandra had done, but the damage was already irreversible. Federal officials were now dealing with not just a personnel compliance issue, but a potential attempt to forge government security credentials. This was the kind of violation that could result in criminal charges and permanent blacklisting from all federal contracts. As I watched the live stream, I saw Sandra's face go completely white as she realized what she had done. She had transformed a manageable personnel problem into a federal crime in front of multiple Pentagon officials. Her attempt to maintain control had destroyed not just the contract, but potentially her entire career and possibly her freedom. General Williams announced that the contract was immediately suspended, pending a comprehensive security review. All classified materials were to be secured, all work was to cease, and Meridian would be subject to a full investigation by multiple federal agencies. The meeting ended with Pentagon officials confiscating Sandra's laptop and escorting the Meridian executives out of their own conference room. The $199 million contract that Sandra had been so determined to control was now completely dead, and criminal investigators would be arriving within hours. As the live stream ended, I sat in my living room reflecting on what I had just witnessed. Sandra's arrogance and incompetence had destroyed a deal that could have secured Meridian's future for years to come. Her decision to fire me over video call attire had escalated into a federal investigation that would probably end her career and could potentially result in prison time. But more than that, her actions had betrayed every employee who depended on Meridian for their livelihood. The company would now face months or years of investigation, massive legal costs, and the loss of their most important contract. All because one person couldn't handle the fact that I wore a sweater during a team meeting. Justice was finally being served, but it was more complete and devastating than I could have ever imagined. By Friday morning, the story had exploded across the business news media. The headline on Federal Contract Weekly read, "Major Defense Contractor Under Federal Investigation for Security Violations." The Washington Post business section ran a piece titled, "Government Contract Worth Millions Suspended After Personnel Dispute." But the real story was happening inside Meridian Defense Solutions, where the company was experiencing a complete institutional meltdown. I learned the details from multiple sources throughout that chaotic day. Rachel called me first thing in the morning, practically whispering into her phone, because the FBI had arrived at the office and was conducting interviews with every employee who had access to classified materials. The federal investigation had expanded beyond simple personnel violations. When cybersecurity experts analyzed Sandra's attempted credential access, they discovered a pattern of questionable activities that raised serious concerns about her integrity and judgment. The forensic audit revealed that Sandra had been accessing classified documents outside of her authorized scope for months. She had been reviewing financial details of the defense contract that were restricted to specific personnel. She had also been copying sensitive correspondence between Meridian and Pentagon officials to her personal drives. But the most damaging discovery was evidence that Sandra had been systematically embezzling funds from the defense contract budget. She had been approving inflated vendor invoices and directing the excess payments to consulting companies that she controlled. The total amount of fraudulent charges exceeded $200,000 over the past 8 months. My termination, it turned out, had been part of Sandra's strategy to cover up her criminal activities. She had been planning to blame any budget discrepancies on my supposed mismanagement of the contract. By removing me and taking direct control of the project finances, she thought she could hide her embezzlement and continue skimming money from the Pentagon contract. The FBI investigators were treating Sandra's attempted credential forgery not as a desperate mistake, but as part of a broader pattern of fraud and deception. They were building a case for multiple federal charges, including theft of government funds, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the United States. James Harrison was facing his own nightmare. As CEO, he was potentially liable for Sandra's criminal activities under corporate responsibility laws. The FBI was investigating whether he knew about the embezzlement and whether other executives had been involved in the cover-up. More importantly for the company's survival, Harrison was trying to salvage some kind of relationship with the Pentagon. He had spent Thursday afternoon and Friday morning in emergency meetings with Defense Department officials, trying to convince them that Sandra's actions were isolated and that Meridian remained a trustworthy contractor. That's when my phone rang with a call I never expected to receive. James Harrison personally called me at 11:30 Friday morning. His voice was strained and exhausted as he explained the situation and asked if I would consider returning to the company to help rebuild their relationship with the Pentagon. The conversation was surreal. Just 5 days earlier, I had been fired for wearing casual clothes during a video call. Now the CEO was personally begging me to come back and save the company from complete destruction. Harrison offered me Sandra's position as department head, along with a significant salary increase and equity compensation. He promised me complete autonomy over the defense contract and guaranteed that I would report directly to him rather than through any intermediate managers. He also offered me a written apology for my wrongful termination and a commitment to implement new policies to prevent similar personnel abuses in the future. But what surprised me most was his honesty about the company's situation. Harrison admitted that Meridian was facing potential bankruptcy if they lost the defense contract permanently. The deal represented more than 40% of their annual revenue, and the investigation was already causing other government clients to reconsider their relationships with the company. He also told me something that made my decision easier. The Pentagon officials had specifically asked about my availability. Colonel Martinez and General Williams had indicated that my return to the company would be viewed favorably during their security review process. I didn't give Harrison an immediate answer, but I did agree to meet with him and the board of directors to discuss terms. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and I was now in a position to negotiate not just my own compensation, but fundamental changes to how Meridian operated. Over the weekend, I consulted with my attorney and developed a comprehensive list of demands for my potential return. These included not just personal compensation issues, but systematic reforms that would protect other employees from experiencing what I had been through. Monday morning brought news that Sandra had been arrested at her home by federal agents. The arrest was covered by local television news, showing Sandra being led away in handcuffs, while FBI agents carried boxes of evidence out of her house. The charges included fraud, embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the federal government. The arrest sent shockwaves through the company and the broader government contracting industry. Sandra had been a rising star in the field, and her fall was both dramatic and complete. Her professional reputation was destroyed, her career was over, and she was facing potentially decades in federal prison. But Sandra's arrest also created an opportunity for Meridian to demonstrate that they were taking the situation seriously and were committed to reform. Harrison called me immediately after the news broke and asked if I was ready to discuss my return to the company. The board meeting was scheduled for Tuesday afternoon, and I spent Monday evening finalizing my negotiation strategy. I wasn't just thinking about my own interests. I was thinking about all the employees who had been affected by Sandra's mismanagement, and all the future employees who might face similar situations. If I was going to return to Meridian, it would be on terms that ensured this kind of abuse could never happen again. And it would be with enough authority to rebuild not just the Pentagon relationship, but the entire culture of the organization. Sandra had tried to destroy me over something as trivial as video call attire. Now I was going to use her downfall to create positive changes that would protect employees and strengthen the company for years to come. The irony was perfect, and the justice was about to be complete. The board meeting on Tuesday afternoon was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my professional career. I walked into the same conference room where Sandra had tried to deceive Pentagon officials just 5 days earlier, but now I was sitting at the head of the table negotiating the terms of my return as the new department head. The board of directors included James Harrison, 3 external investors, and the company's head of legal affairs. They were all acutely aware that their company was facing potential bankruptcy and federal prosecution. My leverage in the negotiation was absolute, and I intended to use it to create lasting positive changes. I began the meeting by outlining my conditions for returning to Meridian. These weren't just salary and title demands. They were comprehensive reforms designed to prevent the kind of abuse that had led to the current crisis. First, I demanded complete autonomy over the defense contract and all related personnel decisions. No manager or executive would be able to override my assessments of security compliance or personnel qualifications. This authority would be written into my employment contract and backed by the board of directors. Second, I required the implementation of a comprehensive remote work policy that protected employees from arbitrary dress code violations and micromanagement. The policy would establish clear performance metrics rather than appearance standards for evaluating remote workers. Third, I insisted on the creation of an employee protection fund that would provide legal support and financial assistance to any employee who faced retaliation for reporting compliance violations or management abuse. This fund would be independently administered and would have sufficient resources to protect whistleblowers from corporate intimidation. Fourth, I demanded the establishment of anonymous reporting systems that would allow employees to report management problems directly to the board of directors without fear of retaliation. These systems would be managed by external firms to ensure independence and confidentiality. Finally, I required a written commitment that the company would implement comprehensive management training programs focused on federal compliance requirements and professional personnel management. No one would be promoted to a supervisory role without demonstrating competency in these areas. The board members listened to my demands with a mixture of relief and anxiety. They were relieved that I was willing to return and help salvage the Pentagon relationship, but they were anxious about the scope of changes I was requiring. James Harrison asked about my salary expectations, and I surprised him by requesting a compensation package that was substantial but reasonable. I wasn't trying to bankrupt the company. I was trying to rebuild it into an organization that I could be proud to work for. The negotiation took most of the afternoon, but by 5 o'clock we had reached an agreement on all major points. My new title would be Vice President of Government Relations with direct authority over all federal contracts and compliance issues. My salary would be doubled from my previous level, and I would receive equity compensation tied to the successful completion of the defense contract. More importantly, the board formally approved all of my proposed policy changes. Meridian Defense Solutions was going to become a model for employee protection and ethical management in the government contracting industry. The announcement of my return was carefully coordinated with Pentagon officials. Colonel Martinez and General Williams had been briefed on the personnel changes and policy reforms, and they had agreed to resume contract negotiations once I was officially reinstated. Wednesday morning brought a flood of media attention. The business press was fascinated by the story of an employee who had been fired for video call attire and then returned as a senior executive after her former boss was arrested by the FBI. The narrative was perfect for the current conversation about workplace rights and corporate accountability, but the real satisfaction came from my first day back in the office. I walked into Meridian's headquarters as Vice President of Government Relations with my own corner office and a team of analysts reporting directly to me. The same colleagues who had watched Sandra humiliate me on Zoom were now congratulating me on my promotion and thanking me for saving their jobs. Rachel Martinez was among the first to welcome me back. She had been promoted to senior analyst and would be working directly with me on the Pentagon contract. As we discussed the project timeline, she mentioned that Sandra's arrest had been a relief to everyone who had worked under her management. Marcus Thompson stopped by my office to share some inside information about the investigation. The FBI had discovered that Sandra's embezzlement activities were more extensive than originally thought. She had been stealing money from multiple contracts over the past 2 years, not just the defense project. The total amount of fraud was approaching $500,000. Sandra's criminal attorney had apparently approached federal prosecutors about a plea bargain, but the government was demanding significant prison time due to the national security implications of her actions. Her attempt to forge security credentials had transformed a white-collar crime into a matter of federal security policy. The most satisfying moment of the week came when I received a call from Colonel Martinez on Thursday afternoon. He informed me that the Pentagon security review was complete and that Meridian had been cleared to resume work on the defense contract. More importantly, the Pentagon was recommending Meridian for additional contracts based on their demonstrated commitment to reform and compliance. The $199 million deal that Sandra had destroyed with her arrogance and criminality was officially restored, and the company was positioned for even greater success in the future. By Friday afternoon, Meridian's stock price had not only recovered from the previous week's losses, but had actually exceeded its pre-crisis level. Investors were responding positively to the news of new Pentagon contracts and the implementation of stronger management policies. I spent Friday evening reviewing the personnel files of Sandra's former team members, identifying employees who had been marginalized or mistreated, and developing plans to restore their career opportunities. Several talented analysts had been considering leaving the company due to Sandra's management style, and I wanted to convince them to stay and contribute to our rebuilding efforts. As I reflected on the week's events, I was struck by the completeness of the reversal. Sandra had tried to humiliate me over video call etiquette, and her actions had ultimately led to her arrest, imprisonment, and complete professional destruction. Meanwhile, I had been promoted to the highest position I had ever held and was leading the most important project in company history. But beyond the personal satisfaction, I was proud of the systemic changes we had implemented. Future employees would be protected from the kind of arbitrary abuse that had nearly destroyed my career. The company had stronger policies, better oversight, and a renewed commitment to ethical management. Sandra had intended to teach me a lesson about corporate hierarchy and personal appearance. Instead, she had taught the entire organization a lesson about integrity, competence, and the consequences of abusing authority. The lesson was more complete and devastating than she could have ever imagined. 6 months later, I was sitting in my corner office reviewing the quarterly performance reports for our expanded Defense Department portfolio when my assistant brought me a newspaper clipping that made me smile. The headline read, "Former Defense Contractor Executive Sentenced to 8 years in Federal Prison." Sandra Patterson had been convicted on 12 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. The judge had imposed the maximum sentence, citing the national security implications of her crimes and her complete lack of remorse during the trial. According to the article, Sandra had refused to accept responsibility for her actions throughout the legal proceedings. Her defense attorney had tried to argue that she was a scapegoat for systemic problems at Meridian, but the evidence of her deliberate criminal conduct was overwhelming. The FBI had traced her embezzlement activities back 3 years and had documented a pattern of escalating fraud that culminated in her attempt to forge federal security credentials. The judge's sentencing statement included a comment that seemed particularly relevant to my experience. He noted that Sandra's abuse of authority and betrayal of trust had not only damaged the government, but had also created a hostile work environment that had nearly destroyed the careers of innocent employees. 8 years in federal prison seemed like appropriate justice for someone who had tried to destroy my life over a video call wardrobe choice. But Sandra's conviction was just one part of the larger transformation that had taken place at Meridian Defense Solutions. Over the past 6 months, we had not only restored our relationship with the Pentagon, but had expanded it into the most successful period in company history. The original $199 million contract had been completed ahead of schedule and under budget. Our cybersecurity infrastructure project had received commendations from military commanders across the eastern seaboard, and the Department of Defense had asked us to bid on 3 additional contracts worth a combined $400 million. The employee protection policies that I had negotiated as conditions of my return had transformed Meridian's corporate culture. The anonymous reporting system had identified and resolved several other instances of management abuse that might have escalated into serious problems. The Employee Protection Fund had provided support to 2 whistleblowers who had reported compliance violations in other departments. Most importantly, the Comprehensive Management Training Program had created a new generation of supervisors who understood that their authority came with responsibility for their employees' professional development and personal dignity. The success of these reforms had attracted attention from across the government contracting industry. I had been invited to speak at 3 professional conferences about workplace protection policies, and Meridian had been featured in Federal Contract Weekly as a model for ethical business practices. My personal career had flourished beyond anything I could have imagined when Sandra fired me over Zoom. My promotion to Vice President of Government Relations had led to recognition as one of the top 40 professionals under 40 in government contracting. I had been appointed to a Pentagon advisory committee on cybersecurity policy, and I was being recruited by larger companies who wanted to benefit from my expertise and reputation. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the impact our story had on other workplace situations. I had received dozens of emails from employees at other companies who had faced similar abuse and had used our example to advocate for better treatment and stronger protection policies. Rachel Martinez had been promoted again and was now managing her own team of analysts. She often mentioned that watching Sandra's downfall had taught her important lessons about the difference between authority and leadership. Marcus Thompson had been promoted to senior project manager and was applying many of our policy innovations to his own department. Even James Harrison had evolved as a leader. He had implemented regular employee feedback sessions and had created new channels for staff to communicate directly with senior management about policy concerns. He often credited the Sandra crisis with teaching him the importance of understanding the details of his company's operations rather than simply delegating responsibility to department heads. The Pentagon relationships that had been nearly destroyed by Sandra's incompetence and criminality were now stronger than they had ever been. Colonel Martinez had become a trusted advisor who regularly consulted with me on cybersecurity policy development. General Williams had recommended Meridian for several high-profile projects based on our demonstrated commitment to integrity and excellence. Last month, I had received the most meaningful recognition of my career, the Department of Defense Civilian Service Award for contributions to national cybersecurity infrastructure. The ceremony was held at the Pentagon with an audience that included many of the officials who had witnessed Sandra's meltdown in our conference room 6 months earlier. As I stood at the podium accepting the award, I thought about the journey that had brought me to that moment. Sandra's decision to fire me over video call attire had seemed like the worst thing that could happen to my career. Instead, it had become the catalyst for the most successful and meaningful period of my professional life. The experience had taught me that sometimes the people who try to diminish you are actually providing you with opportunities to demonstrate your true worth. Sandra's arrogance and incompetence had created the circumstances that allowed me to showcase my expertise, leadership abilities, and commitment to ethical business practices. But more than personal vindication, the situation had taught me about the importance of using difficult experiences to create positive changes that benefit others. I could have simply taken my settlement money and moved on to another company. Instead, I had chosen to use Sandra's downfall as an opportunity to implement systemic reforms that would protect future employees from similar abuse. The employee protection policies we had implemented at Meridian were now being adopted by other companies across the industry. The anonymous reporting systems were being studied by corporate governance experts as models for preventing management abuse. The comprehensive training programs were being replicated by government contractors who wanted to avoid the kind of crisis that had nearly destroyed Sandra's career and our company. Looking back on that Tuesday morning when Sandra humiliated me over Zoom, I realized that her actions had revealed more about her character than mine. Her willingness to destroy someone's career over something as trivial as video call clothing had exposed a fundamental lack of judgment and integrity that eventually led to her criminal downfall. The lesson I had learned was that justice often takes time, but it tends to be more complete when you allow people's own actions to expose their true nature. Sandra had destroyed herself through her own arrogance and criminality. My role had simply been to maintain my integrity and competence, while her character flaws created the circumstances for her downfall. But the most important lesson was about the power of turning injustice into positive change. The worst experience of my professional life had become the foundation for the best outcomes I had ever achieved. Sandra's attempt to humiliate and dismiss me had ultimately led to my promotion recognition and the opportunity to create lasting improvements in workplace protection and corporate governance. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the doorway to your greatest strength. When people try to diminish you for superficial reasons, they often reveal their own character flaws while giving you the opportunity to show your true worth. Justice might not be immediate, but it's often more complete when you let people's own actions expose their failures. Sandra had taught me that lesson more thoroughly than any business school or professional development program ever could have. And for that education, despite everything she had put me through, I was actually grateful. The experience had made me stronger, wiser, and more committed to using my success to help others who face similar challenges. That was a legacy worth building, and it was infinitely more valuable than any government contract or corporate promotion. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced workplace injustice where someone in authority abused their power over something trivial or personal? How did you handle the situation, and what lessons did you learn about standing up for yourself while maintaining your professional integrity? Share your story in the comments below, and let's support each other in creating better workplace environments for everyone. If this story resonated with you, please like this video to help others find it. Subscribe to my channel for more stories about overcoming workplace challenges and building professional resilience. And please share this with anyone who might benefit from hearing about how injustice can sometimes become the foundation for positive change. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it inspires you to never let anyone diminish your worth or potential, no matter how much authority they think they have over you. Your true value will always find a way to shine through, especially when you use difficult experiences as opportunities to grow stronger and help others along the way.